What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my top 18 Week 9 quarterback rankings. If you guys enjoy, hit the like button, subscribe. If you have any questions, drop them down below. I'll make sure to get back to every single person. But let's just dive right into the quarterback rankings here. We are going to start off in Tier 1, and my quarterback 1 this week is going to be Jalen Hurts. He is coming off by far his best game of the season, 35.1 points. The rushing production was truly top tier. The tush push was working. I believe he scored 3 rushing touchdowns. And then he draws a really nice matchup this week going up against the Jaguars. The Jaguars have allowed the second most points per game to the quarterback position. So I think Jalen Hurts, like he is normally in your normal size leagues, he's obviously going to be a smash play. Now, my other Tier 1 quarterback is going to be Lamar Jackson. And this really is a pretty tough matchup, honestly, against the Broncos. They've allowed the 4th fewest points per game to the quarterback position, but I feel like Lamar Jackson is in that tier where he's pretty much matchup proof at this point. The dude's averaging 25.3 points per game. They added Deontay Johnson. Now, I don't think Deontay is going to play a huge role here in his first week, but it's just another weapon here for Lamar Jackson. I definitely think he should be considered the consensus QB1 rest of season. Now, moving into Tier 2, going to start off this tier with Jaden Daniels going up against the Giants. In his healthy games, you remove Week 7, he is averaging 22.4 points per game. Fine matchup here against the Giants. I think Jaden Daniels, high-end QB1. And then the other guy here in Tier 2 is going to be Josh Allen going up against the Dolphins. The Dolphins have actually allowed the fewest points per game to the quarterback spot, but I still feel like Josh Allen's in that upper echelon of fantasy quarterbacks, where regardless of the matchup, he's still going to be a strong play. I think this offense is developing kind of interestingly. You had the addition of Amari Cooper. He had a nice first game. Didn't do a ton in week 2, with the team. Did kind of expand his role a little bit. But I do think we're seeing Amari Cooper kind of open some things up for these other wide receivers. Khalil Shakir is coming off a big game. I think having Amari Cooper out wide as like that clear-cut number 1 option, or at least, appearing to be the number 1 option to defenses, is going to open some things up for Shakir in the slot. We have Keon Coleman starting to break out. Back-to-back really strong games out of him. So I think this, receiving core is kind of coming together here. We know Josh Allen's a top-tier fantasy option. He is my quarterback for this week, even in a tough matchup. Now, moving into Tier 3, going to start off this tier with Joe Burrow. And Burrow is the quarterback 5 in points per game, so, pretty in line with my ranking here. I will say, we want to monitor the injury of T. Higgins. It's obviously going to be better for Burrow if both Chase and Higgins are healthy, but I still think regardless, he's going to be a strong play, but maybe he does get bumped down a few spots if Higgins cannot play. My quarterback 6 is going to be Kyler Murray. It's a tough matchup here against the Bears. They've allowed the 2nd fewest points per game to the quarterback spot, but Kyler's been a pretty solid fantasy option, especially as of late. 20-plus points in 3 of his last 4 games. We know he has that rushing upside. Marvin Harrison Jr. is coming off a big game. Trey McBride's coming off a big game. Some solid weapons for Kyler. So I think he's a nice mid-tier QB1 option. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Jordan Love going up against the Lions. It's been a little bit tough, right? We had the injury early on with Love. Then he left this most recent game with a groin injury. Obviously a situation we're going to have to monitor. If it seems like he is going to be super limited, then he would probably take a hit. But if we're hearing he's healthy, good to go, this is where he would slot in for me here going up against the Lions. In his healthy games, he has been a really strong fantasy option, 20.6 points per game in those healthy outings. So even though, the injuries have been unfortunate, when he's out there, he has been a really nice play. Now, shifting into a very, very large Tier 4, these are like your back-end QB1s through your high-end QB2s. You're kind of balancing the quality of quarterback play versus the matchup. Definitely some close calls within this tier. But I'm going to start it off with Kirk Cousins going up against the Cowboys. Now, Kirk Cousins has not been the most reliable option week to week. He's been somewhat boom or bust, but we have seen him put together 2 huge games against the Buccaneers in favorable matchups. Those have been the 2 games that have really carried his overall production, and he draws a pretty nice matchup here against the Cowboys, who have allowed the 6th most points per game to the quarterback position. So if there was a spot where I was going to play Kirk, he has the weapons, London, Pitts, Mooney. I think this is a good spot here against the Cowboys. Another guy that has a somewhat favorable matchup, we have Sam Darnold going up against the Colts. They have allowed the 10th most points per game to the quarterback spot. We know Sam Darnold has Justin Jefferson, the wide receiver 1. He has Jordan Addison. Now it looks like he might be getting TJ Hawkinson back. Now, I'm not overly bullish on TJ Hawkinson coming in and balling out from day one, but it's another piece of this offense that is going to benefit Sam Darnold. I do think losing Christian Darrisaw is really tough for this offense, but they've gone out, they brought in Cam Robinson, still a downgrade, but I mean, that's the best kind of, replacement you're going to get mid-season. So I think that was a good move for the Vikings, especially for their fantasy options and Sam Darnold. So I think he's a fine back-end QB1 play. Then I have Patrick Mahomes going up against the Buccaneers. And for the vast majority of this season, Patrick Mahomes has been pretty much unplayable for fantasy. He is coming off his best fantasy game of the season. It's a pretty low bar. I think it was like a little over 18 points, which for Mahomes, like he's had seasons where he's averaging over that. That's been his best game here through 8 weeks of the NFL season, but he is a very, very strong matchup here against the Buccaneers. They've allowed the most points per game to the quarterback spot. Vegas has them top 3 in implied points this week. You have the addition of DeAndre Hopkins, didn't play a huge role in week 8. I'm not overly high on D-Hop moving forward, but it's definitely a plus for this offense. Travis Kelce's coming off a big game. You have Xavier Worthy. I think if you've, held on to Patrick Mahomes for this long, this would be an opportunity to play him in this favorable matchup. After Mahomes, we have another guy with a pretty favorable matchup here. It is Bo Nix going up against the Ravens. The Ravens have allowed the 3rd most points per game to the quarterback spot, and Bo Nix is playing at a pretty high level here. I will say, the matchup looks good. Bo Nix, 20-plus points in 3 of his last 4 games. Probably the best game of his NFL career, short NFL career so far. Week 8, 284 passing yards, 4 total touchdowns, 3 through the air, 1 on the ground. The one thing that's really sketching me out here is, you look at the matchup, you look at his production, you think he would be this really strong play. According to Vegas, the Broncos have the 2nd lowest implied point total. So they are not expecting this offense to do well against the Ravens. Even though this Ravens defense has been suspect, they are not expecting a big offensive game. So that's sketching me out a little bit here, but I still think with the matchup, Bo Nix is playable as like a back-end quarterback 1. Also in tier 4, going to go with Baker Mayfield. And if you don't like this Baker ranking, I get it. I honestly think if there has been one player that I have misranked pretty much every single week, it is Baker Mayfield, because I don't think anyone was overly high on him heading into the season. He starts off really strong, but then I was looking at the matchups. The matchups were pretty weak. It was all right, I think he's going to fall off a little bit in some of these tougher matchups. Then he goes out, he balls out in the tougher matchup. So I'm all right, now I'm going to give him his respect. Then he loses Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. It's all right, he loses both of those dudes. I think their production has to fall off at this point. And then he goes out last week, still has a strong game. He's put up 22 plus points in his last 5. The problem here, it's maybe I'm underranking him again, but now he doesn't have the weapons, and he has a really tough matchup here against the Chiefs. The Buccaneers have the 3rd fewest implied points. So at this point, maybe you should not be trusting my ranking of Baker Mayfield because it has not been super accurate. But that's what I'm thinking here. I do think Liam Cohen, their offensive coordinator, the dude's been a wizard. What he's been able to overcome with these injuries, at least last week, how he had Baker playing early on in the season has been very impressive. I just don't know if we're going to get great quarterback play against this Chiefs defense without Mike Evans, without Chris Godwin. But I've been proven wrong pretty consistently here by Baker Mayfield this season. So that's my argument. If you want to just set him and forget him because he's been balling out, I'm really not going to blame you there, but that's my take. And then after Baker, going to go with Matthew Stafford going up against the Seahawks. Had really not been a super relevant option fantasy-wise, but he gets Kupp and Puka back, goes for 279 yards through the air, 4 touchdowns. With these weapons, the caliber of quarterback that Matthew Stafford is, I think he's going to be a nice fantasy option moving forward. And then the final guy here in tier 4 is going to be Jared Goff. And honestly, this does feel a little low for Goff. This tier is just super congested. You could be flipping these dudes around within this tier. He's the quarterback 11 in points per game. I will say not a great matchup. The Packers have allowed the 8th fewest points per game to the quarterback spot, but I do think the fact that they're underdogs is interesting because we have seen Jared Goff. He is not racking up a lot of passing volume. Even this most recent game, he was efficient, had the touchdowns, but the passing volume just has not been there because it's not been game scripts where they're trailing. They need a ton of pass attempts. I think there was one game where he went nuclear in terms of the pass attempts. So this could be one of those games, right? They're 3.5-point underdogs. Maybe we finally see that passing volume, 30-plus attempts, but that's been the concern. So that's where he's settling in for me here. It's a high-end QB2, but I still think he's a very fine play. Now, moving into the final tier, tier 5, going to start off with Caleb Williams going up against the Cardinals. The Bears and Caleb Williams are coming off a pretty brutal game off the bye. You would like to see, a team with a rookie quarterback, young wide receiver in Rome Odunze. You would like to see them take some sort of leap coming out of the bye. I guess maybe that was wishful thinking because their offense had looked so great in the 2 games before it, but just not a great performance from this unit. But this is a pretty favorable matchup here against the Cardinals. The Cardinals have allowed the 7th most points per game to the quarterback spot, so I still think he's a fine play, but consistency hasn't quite been there yet for Caleb Williams and the Bears offense. Then after Caleb, going to go with Geno Smith. This is kind of just where he's settling in. He's the quarterback 15 in points per game. I have him ranked as the quarterback 16, has had a lot of passing volume. Efficiency touchdowns haven't necessarily followed, and it's a pretty neutral matchup here against the Rams. Then I'm going to have Dak Prescott as my quarterback 17 going up against the Falcons. The Falcons are top 10 in points per game allowed to the quarterback spot. We just saw Baker have a pretty decent day, despite missing those weapons. And then the Cowboys have a solid 24.5 implied points. So Dak, fine mid-tier QB2. And then the last guy in these rankings, I do think these last few, there's a lot of potential quarterbacks who could have slotted in here. I went with Tua going up against the Bills. I know he really hasn't been great against the Bills, I think in the last 3 games, but I don't know if I'm taking that 3-game sample size and just assuming he's going to be terrible this week. But if you don't like Tua, there are a ton of other honorable mentions. Aaron Rodgers, CJ Stroud, Jameis coming off a big game, Joe Flacco stepping in for Anthony Richardson. Always love me some Justin Herbert. Just going to depend on the matchup. Not great this week. And then they're going to be run heavy, but lots of dudes who could kind of filter in this QB 18 or later area. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 18. Any questions, drop them down below. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.